Today, brethren, I want to talk a little bit about fearful, scared, nervous Christians, because we have a certain number of those. And we'll analyze human fears, because we all have them, and also analyze how human fears have blocked spiritual growth of so many members in the Church of God in 1979. A few months ago, back in January of this year, I was at a meeting of the church during which the leading minister had to be disfellowshipped. And of course, that's a rather traumatic event. And during the meeting, some very unfortunate things were said and were done that, were said and done by people whose hearts were not totally right before God. The spirit of rebellion seemed to be agitating and gripping at certain ministers at the time. And a few were openly manifesting a kind of an insurrectionist attitude towards the Church of God and the government of God and Mr. Armstrong. It looked very ominous. It was very scary. It was frightening. It appeared to be very negative. I felt very apprehensive. As the meeting went on, I guess I grew more and more apprehensive, and that's sort of my reaction to life. Far too often I get sort of nervous and worried. And I noticed a couple of ministers who were openly squabbling about the government of God, and it was upsetting and frightening. Well, I turned to a fellow minister who was sitting next to me, and I said to him with a certain amount of visible emotion and fear, and there was fear in my voice, I said, I wonder if this means the end of the Church of God. It was a very stupid thing to say, I'll admit. But sometimes you say stupid things, and I said a stupid thing. But he looked at me, and there was a kind of a surprised look on his face, and then very quietly, very gently, and calmly, he quoted a scripture to me. He looked at me and he said, fear not, little flock. That's what he said. Fear not, little flock. That's in Matthew, by the way. Because it's your Father's good pleasure to give to you the kingdom of God. It was a gentle rebuke. I deserved it. I'm glad he said it. You see, he had watched the same proceedings I had with faith and calm conviction that everything was going to work out fine, that God was in charge, and as negative as it perhaps looked at the time and as ominous as things seemed to be, it was all going to work out, and he knew it. Now, I had watched the same proceedings, and it allowed apprehension and fear and a certain kind of, human panic, dread, call it what you may, well up within me to the point that I felt terrible anxiety and a kind of a visceral fear that I couldn't cope with, and I simply verbalized it. Out it came. And he didn't have that kind of reaction at all. Well, frankly, the scripture he quoted snapped me back to reality, and I'm glad he quoted it. And it brought me back to the realization that Jesus Christ, some 2,000 years ago, in the middle of an awful world in which he lived that was filled with all kinds of uncertainty and problems, Jesus Christ was continually saying to his disciples, was he not? Don't fear. Don't be afraid, because I'm in charge, and everything is going to work out all right. Now you see, it has in the Church of God. Everything, well not everything, but so many things have and are in the process of working out. And Jesus Christ is in charge. And we don't have to fear. But that seems to be a hard lesson to learn, doesn't it? For members of the Church of God. And even for some ministers in the Church of God. When I talk to brethren, so many seem to be paralyzed with unresolved, unnecessary fears and anxieties of all kinds. The fear of not making it into the kingdom of God. Pretty common fear, I have to admit. The fear of persecution. The fear of being unprepared to flee when it's time to flee. Fear of losing the love of a mate or someone that you love. And that can be an awful fear when you're an insecure kind of a person. A lot of people fear losing jobs, and they know they're going to go through a rough time economically, and some people can see that their job isn't necessarily the kind of job that goes on and on and on in a time of economic strife. And they're afraid of not being able to make the mortgage, or afraid of not being able to, send the kids to college. Some people are awfully afraid of what may happen to their kids. They're afraid our kids won't turn out, or they'll get into drugs, and people get very uptight about what can happen to the kids. Some people fear the Church of God is going through something that is negative and not positive. And I can say, no, it's positive, and some people say, no, it's got to be negative because your reaction is a fear reaction to almost anything that occurs. And of course, fear is the opposite of faith. We have fear reactions far too often. People fear something ominous is happening in the Church of God. Some people fear social events, and some people fear other people. This after services when the Last prayer is said and the closing hymn is mentioned, and some people run out the door 99 miles an hour. I don't criticize them. I do know what the problem is. They're frightened. They're frightened of people. When I first went to services in Pasadena, I was sort of scared. It was hard. I remember wandering around downstairs in Shakespeare Club, sort of thinking, well, I got to go back upstairs because that's where the people are. But downstairs, you see, there was nobody down there. I know people who hide out. People are afraid of people. People are afraid of disease and cancer and things of that type. People are afraid of dying. A lot of people are afraid of Satan and demons. And maybe that's significant because the dragon of fear seems to be stalking the people of God once again. He's done it for 1900 years, but he seems to be intensifying his effort. And when I say the dragon of fear, I'm not talking symbolically. The dragon of fear is Satan the devil. And Satan the devil is the author of fear, the instigator of this fear instinct, which I think I can prove today. And he is wreaking terrible havoc and always has and will always attempt to do so. Havoc in the minds, the emotions, the hearts, the bodies of the people of God, using fear as a weapon. He's afraid. He's terribly afraid. And he'll try to make you afraid. And fear is so terribly destructive to the point the Church of God has had spiritual dropouts because of fear. We've even had our suicides, sad to say. And a suicide victim is a person who's afraid to face life, and generally, and you have to go on beyond being afraid to face life, he's afraid to face himself, you see. He can't live with himself. His fear of himself and his weaknesses and his own problems becomes so strong that he cannot cope with the fact that he exists. Now, I knew a man in Canada, baptized 11 years, 6 children. The youngest was 5, and he blew his brains out last year. And yet, he was a Christian. He was a member of the Church of God. And somehow, brethren, he lost his moorings spiritually and emotionally. And the fear of sin, the fear of himself, I knew him well. The fear of failure, the fear of responsibility was there at the core of it all and had not yet been overcome. And it's so sad because it could have been and it should have been. It can be in every single case. You know how to conquer fear in a society in which fear is rampant. It's every place. I know that scientists and sociologists and all of the professional people are telling us that this 20th century is the most anxiety-ridden, fear-filled era of any era in human history. Now, I've read a few books where they said, well, back in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, when people were being persecuted and there were all of these terrible wars and death and dying and plagues, maybe then there was almost as much anxiety and fear as there is now. A lot of people say there's more now. There's more now. Most prominent psychiatrists say that fear, though they would use the term anxiety, but I won't use their words because I don't follow their system. They would say anxiety, but they mean fear. Fear is the number one emotional problem, the number one emotional killer in our age. And frankly, with all of the crime and all of the fighting and all of the bickering and all of the brutality and all of the frightful behavior that goes on around us, I'm not surprised. We live in a frightening world. This is a frightening age. And too many members of the Church of God are scared. Why are we scared? And how can we cope with it? When the pulse begins to increase and the heart begins to pound, you ever have that happen? The heart begins to pound and you get this dry feeling in your mouth and the perspiration begins to flow and all this adrenaline is shooting through the system and the fear begins to well up. What do? Do you do anything? How do you cope? The book of Luke chapter 21. Those are questions we have to answer, and we can, because there are answers. Luke chapter 21, it's a prophecy. Verse 20, it describes our age and discusses the number one emotional problem of our times in the world. I wouldn't call it the number one emotional problem in the Church of God. It is in the world. We have other problems, but it certainly contributes to many of our problems and is there continually robbing us of faith and paralyzing a lot of our members spiritually and causing emotional distress. Chapter 21, verse 20. When you shall see Jerusalem compassed about with armies, these will be European armies, not Arab armies. This isn't talking about Arab armies here. European armies. Then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let the members that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them that are in the middle of it depart out. These are the days of vengeance, verse 22. It's a pretty frightening term, the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Woe unto those that are with child. it means people will have problems, and there will be anxieties when we flee. A lot of anxiety, but we can cope with it, brethren. It doesn't have to overwhelm us. Woe unto those that are with child, and to those that are nursing babies in those days. For there shall be great distress and a lot of anxiety in the land, and fear, and many, many negative emotions, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and Jerusalem, the end of the verse, shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, by European Gentiles in context, until the time of a Gentile shall be fulfilled. There shall be signs in the sun, the moon, and in the stars. And upon the earth, notice, distress. So that describes our time. Distress, apprehension, fear, upset, just a gigantic emotional uproar in the nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. And then, verse 26, it begins to have its effect on us physically. Men's hearts will start failing them because of fear. People start having heart attacks because of their anxieties. They'll start to snap physically. They'll also start to snap mentally and emotionally in greater numbers than ever before. Men's hearts will fail, snap, stop, because of fear and tension. You ever hear of hypertension? And for looking after those things that are coming upon the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Sure, fear is the number one problem in our age. And verse 26 says so. Then, in so many words, then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to come to pass, talking to true Christians who shouldn't, have their lives based and destroyed or limited by fear, then we're to look up, not down, but up, and lift up our heads, hold our heads high, because our redemption draws nigh. We don't have to fear. Verse 26, though, discusses the emotional cost, the frightening toll of fear, and it is staggering. The heart can fail, the mind can snap. 1 American in 200, and it may be now 1 American in 175, for all I know, because that's a statistic which is a couple of years old. At one time, 1 in 200 was confined to a mental asylum or to a psychiatric ward because of emotional problems. And 99% of the time, brethren, 99% of the time, pure, raw, unresolved, unnecessary fear is the core of most of those problems. People flee into themselves. They retreat into some little secret room back somewhere in the mind. And they do it to shut out a world of which they're afraid. And they don't have to face then things that cause anxieties. Some people fear God in a morbid way. We have brethren like that are terrorized of God. And it's morbid and it's unhealthy. And that can cause a nervous breakdown, and it has in a few cases. Other people fear failure, or they fear themselves, or they fear people around them. And so people retreat into themselves, and we call that reaction nervous breakdowns. But nervous means fear-filled. It's the same term. It's as a result of bad nerves and fears and that type of thing. When I was 7 years old, I remember my mother had gone through some very trying times. A divorce when I was 6, which was trying for her and trying for me. And I guess trying for my father as well. She had gone through a plane crash which had almost destroyed her completely and had been in the hospital for about a year. And, difficult things that occurred in her life. And one day, I remember it well, she went to bed, fell asleep in the afternoon for an afternoon nap, and she didn't wake up for 8 months. She didn't wake up for 8 long months. That is, she wouldn't wake up. Maybe she could have. But the doctor said that something had simply snapped. That some kind of phobia, fear of society, fear of what might happen to her, the fear had become so strong that she'd simply withdrawn into some little secret place back in her mind. And she wouldn't wake up and didn't for 7 months. Kind of a coma, if you want to call it that. And then for 10 years when she did wake up, she was afraid to leave the house. She was afraid of anything and everything. People, she couldn't shop. She would walk out on the sidewalk and simply pass out because of fear. A fear reaction that simply generalized to so many things in life. It's a medical fact, brethren, that anxieties place more stress on the human mind and the human heart. Probably more than any other stimulus, including exercise and fatigue. You can work hard, but the hard work, though it may place a certain amount of stress on the body to some degree, doesn't place the same kind of stress that anxiety and worry and fear is going to build. Now, fear can limit your normal lifespan. In fact, it does 99% of the time. Now, unresolved fear builds tensions, does it not? And tension can build hypertension. Do you see the progression? And hypertension does affect the heart. When your blood pressure goes up, when you're under pressure, it can kill you. Now, every time you feel fear of some type, strong fear, panic, that emotion creates a chemical reaction in the body. There is a chemical reaction when you're afraid. And it shoots adrenaline into the system. And that's okay if it's for a brief period of time. Small amounts of adrenaline are good for you, and they keep you on your toes. If you have to give a speech in Spokesman's Club, you need some adrenaline. It makes you prepared, and makes you feel sharper and more aware of things. It's a good stimulus. So from time to time, fear kept within proper limits is a good thing. There are good fears, and there are bad fears. There is even good anxiety. There's nothing wrong with having a certain amount of anxiety from time to time, as long as you keep it within bounds. There are good forms of anxiety. But the point is this: the stimulus becomes permanent. If anxiety is there all the time, you are uptight and tense like a guitar string 24 hours a day, and you can't sleep, and you're always tense. If adrenaline is allowed to surge through your system all the time, unchecked in large amounts, it'll wreak havoc, and there will be penalties, and it will limit your lifespan. You won't live 95 years. You won't make it to your 80. In 1970, I had what I would call a middle-range heart attack. It was not a little one. It was not a big one. It was big enough to be very, very frightening, and I know what a heart attack is because I had one. And it was frightening because I was barely past the age of 30, and I was far too young to go, and far too young to have that kind of thing happen to me. That I can assure you. Now, there are many reasons why it occurred. I suppose that my childhood had predisposed me to be a nervous kind of a person. If you know me at all, you can, people say, oh, well, you make all of these funny motions and gestures because you've been over in Europe. And they do that. And that's true to some degree, but I also do it because, you see, I get rid of all of this nervous energy. That's also part of the picture. Now, I think I was predisposed to it by a lot of things in childhood. The divorce of parents is a very upsetting and unsettling event for a child. And I had a certain number of diseases. I had polio when I was in my early teens, and I had tuberculosis, a mild case of it as a young child. And there was an unstructured family, which of course creates insecurities in a kid as he grows up. That makes you nervous. My socialization process as a child went on in a very unstructured kind of an environment, in different homes and foster families and that type of thing. But I think even by heredity, I was a rather timid kid. And more of a fearful child. Some kids, some babies, when they're 3 months old, if you sort of walk by them, they jerk. Other kids are so peaceful, nothing bothers them. Some little kids are simply born with a certain proclivity to be a little more nervous and a little more fearful than other kids. And I guess I was. I remember in school, one of the hardest things as a kid growing up in school was to put up my hand. Now, some of your kids, they're shooting up their hand all the time. I remember sitting there. I'd always sit at the back of the class, as far away as I could get, where nobody would see me. They always did, because I was always the tallest in the class. Used to hate the fact that I always grew faster than the other kids because the teachers could always see me, and I couldn't hide. I tried. But, to make myself put that hand up, I can remember sitting there, and it was hard, a very painful experience. I remember in 1957, my first speech in Ambassador College. I was a frightened kid, and, of course, all these speech classes and speech clubs and this type of thing. I had to give my first speech in speech class. It was a devastating experience. You think your first experience giving your first speech in Spokesman's Club was terrible. I think mine could beat anybody's experience. I was nauseated beforehand. It wrecked at least a whole week in advance. For a whole week I was useless. I remember the day came, my mouth was dry. It felt like it was full of cotton. And my name was announced, and I walked up to give the speech. There was a little podium there. I walked up to the podium. I'd memorized the speech by heart. Every single word. I knew every line. I knew the whole thing by heart. And I opened my mouth, and everybody said it came out quite well. But I went blank. I blocked it out completely. I had no idea what happened. I have no recollection of that speech at all. I remember sitting down, and I remember standing up and going up there, and after 6 minutes sitting down. But what happened in the middle? No recollection at all. None. You know what happened? I sort of snapped. That's what I did. It's a kind of like a 6-minute nervous breakdown. I blocked it out completely, withdrew into some secret little room back there, and my mouth rattled the thing, out it came. But I don't remember doing it. Now, I'd like you to know, however, that I have overcome that to some degree. And I really do know what I'm saying today, and you know, a lot of that is gone. That's just some of the background. Now, this heart attack thing occurred in France a few weeks after we arrived for the first time in 1967, so that's now 12 years ago. We were happy to be there, of course, but there was a lot of anxiety. When you arrive in a new country, in a new city, it's full of anxiety. The fear of a new job. I mean, I had to raise up a church in Paris, France. I'd never lived in France in my life. Never. And I visited there once for a week and a half in advance. And there's this gigantic, very foreign city, and a little group of about 50 people sort of peering up at me at services, and I'd never seen in my life before. And I had to, you know, begin services. There's a lot of anxiety involved, wondering, will the people like you? Will they not like you? Will they get up and walk out? What will happen? It's sort of scary. And that was frightening. Then there was a new country, and France is something else. I mean, that is one of the most innovating countries that you can possibly live in. People run around madly, screaming, shouting, insulting you. And I don't just mean church members. They don't do much of that, but other people do. It's quite a country. I loved it, I have to admit, but it's very Latin, very sort of noisy. And in some ways it is wonderful, and in some ways it's positively awful. Really, I love France. I have this love-hate relationship with France. I love it, and I hate the place. You know, if God says go back, I'll go back. That's okay. We had a new house. We had our kids, two of our kids had just had whooping cough, and that creates anxiety. So you see, the level sort of builds up to a certain point. And then the clincher, 2 weeks after we arrived in France and all this anxiety was building, Mr. Waterhouse arrived to visit the church and to give a sermon. Now, that of itself doesn't create anxiety. But the way it happened did. I'd gotten a telegram from Catherwood telling me that Mr. Waterhouse was going to arrive at Orly Airport, south of Paris, at 5 o'clock Friday afternoon. So I read the telegram, Orly Airport, 5 o'clock. I arrived an hour in advance. You know, I wasn't going to be late, you see. I get uptight when I'm late. I start getting uptight, and then, you know, the heart begins to pound. I can't take it when I'm late. I get tense. So I was there an hour in advance, sitting, waiting, and I was noticing one of these little things that tell the time of the arrival. I couldn't find the number of his flight. Then I began to walk around getting nervous, and then I checked with one of the hostesses, and she said, "Oh, you're at the wrong airport. He doesn't arrive here. He arrives at Le Bourget, which is north of Paris, 40 miles, which was 70 miles from Orly, and it was 5:30 Friday afternoon." They'd given me the wrong airport when they had telegrammed through from Catherwood. It wasn't my fault, it was their fault. So, I was at the wrong airport, thanks to Catherwood. Well, I was shattered. I tell you, I knew that his plane was arriving at 5:30. It was already 5:30. It was 70 miles away, and I had to drive through Paris, France at rush hour for the first time in my life. I'd only been there 2 weeks. There were no freeways around the city. There is one now, but there wasn't one then. And if you have ever been to France or driven through Paris at rush hour in the middle of all of that traffic, you may have some idea what I had to go through, because I knew I was late. I knew I had to get there, and I drove like a madman, like all the rest of them were doing. And close calls by the dozens. All that traffic, it's a horrendous thing to drive through Paris, France, any time of the day. But 5:30, Friday afternoon, when everyone is trying to get out of the city, get to the country and escape, it is something else. Well, I arrived at Le Bourget, of course, at about 7:30, 2 hours after he arrived, in one awful looking state. And like a guitar string, stretched way too tight, about ready to snap. He wasn't there, of course. He'd arrived at 5:30. I wasn't there. He wasn't worried at all. He'd gone downtown, gotten to his hotel, and he was fine. He wasn't angry. I was sure that he'd be furious. He wasn't mad at all. He was fine. Mr. Waterhouse is a lovely human being. He didn't care. But, how was I to know that? You see, I assumed he would be angry. I just assumed it. Well, that night it hit me, and it really hit me hard, and I'll never forget that as long as I live. As long as I live, I'll not forget that night, either with my wife. That was really a scary occasion. Well, it took about 2 weeks to get back on my feet. I think there were a lot of miracles that took place. And since that time, I've looked after myself. I don't drive through Paris at rush hour. I don't drive through Los Angeles at rush hour either, except on very rare occasion, but it's a lot easier here. I learned a lesson. Fear and anxiety can kill. It almost killed me, you see. It can kill the body. The heart can snap. The mind can snap. It can destroy emotions. And those reactions are not of God, and we ought not have them. We've got to learn to control that type of thing, especially in this age. Extreme unresolved fear and anxieties, brethren, are just not a part of the plan of God. for the church of God in these end times. Isaiah chapter 35. Turn to that and you'll see that we're to preach and teach, in fact, in the church of God. That we ought to conquer fear and anxiety and the pressures of Christian living in this age and family living and the trials and the problems. Don't have to stretch you out of shape and turn you into an emotional basket case at all. They should not. Isaiah chapter 35 verse 1. Notice what it says. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them. This is the kingdom of God being described. And the desert shall rejoice and blossom as a rose. It will blossom out. Isaiah 35 verse 2. It'll blossom out. Now it says in the Hebrew, it'll be full of flowers. The flowers will bloom abundantly every place. Blossoms on all the hills and every place you look. Rejoice even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it, and the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. And we shall see the glory of God. We'll see Jesus Christ, and the excellency of our God will be there, and we'll rule with Him. It'll be a wonderful time. But that's often the feature of what's happening right now. What is happening right now? That's our reward. And there'll be no fear then. But there are things to fear now. What do we say to the church of God now? Verse 3, a prophecy for us and our message. Strengthen you the weak hands. What's a weak hand? Is a hand that's going like this, you see, that's all shaky and these are the hands of frightened human beings. It proves that we will have certain problems in that direction in this age, otherwise He wouldn't tell us to do it. And confirm the feeble knees. Now, feeble knees are the knees of scared human beings. That means shaky knees. Ever had your knees shake and you couldn't stop them? Never? I did once. I never thought it could happen. I mean, I didn't know that literally your knees could begin to shake and you couldn't stop them no matter what you did. Your head wouldn't do it. Nothing would do it. And you simply had to stand there until it stopped. The day I was married, and I was happy to get married, but I was scared nonetheless. I remember in the lower gardens of the college, there's a place called the Tempietto where my wife and I were married. And the groom always hides behind the Tempietto while the bride, until the ceremony's ready, with the minister. The minister was Mr. Armstrong. He married us. And I was back there with him, and he was sort of giving me a little sermon about the importance of marriage, which I really didn't need because I was already overwhelmed by the responsibility of it all, but he was sort of talking about it. And all of a sudden, my knees, not my legs, but my knees began to do funny, began to twitch. Never happened in my life before. And the twitch got worse and worse, and then they literally began to shake, just the knees. And they wouldn't stop. And I can remember during the ceremony getting down to pray, as we do at the end of the marriage ceremony, thinking, I don't know if I can do this. Because, you have to be, when you get down, you have to be down. And I wasn't sure my knees would hold me up. They did. But they shook to the end of the ceremony. It happened to me once in my life. I know what this means. Confirm the feeble knees. Now that's symbolic. That's symbolic, of course. And say to those of a fearful heart, verse 4, notice, a fearful heart. Do you have a fearful heart? Do you have a spirit of fear within you? Yes, you do. Every one of you does. Even the most, bold, rambunctious, self-possessed person in the hall does to some degree. Say to them of a fearful heart, be strong and don't fear. Don't be afraid. Now, obviously, there are things in this age to be afraid of. There are going to be problems and stresses and trials. We've got to counteract those events, you see, with an emphasis on a very positive message. Be strong and don't fear, brethren, because God is going to come with vengeance. He'll come with a recompense. He'll come and He's going to save us. And we're never, never again going to have to experience fear and anxiety or tension or panic or that type of emotion again. We'll have perfect emotions in the kingdom of God, which is, a lot different from the emotions we have right now. You won't have to experience fear then. But we do now. Why do we experience fear? Now, where does it come from? If you're fearful, if you have any kind of anxiety, what's the source of it? What's the origin? First of all, we need to grasp that fear is a universal problem. We all have it. It applies to everybody. And apprehension and tension and fright very easily. As I said earlier, there are good fears and there are good anxieties. There are bad fears and there are bad anxieties. And the good ones, you don't want to lose them. God fully intended you to have certain good anxieties. And a certain balanced amount of anxiety and a certain amount of adrenaline shooting into the system is a stimulus to help you be a better person and to help you, keep you from harm. The fear of hurting yourself keeps you from driving 120 miles down the freeway, because there's a certain fear there. That's a good fear. The fear of getting sick
may keep some of you from eating in a way that would cause the sickness. And that's a healthy fear. No problem. The fear of flopping in spokesman's club and just being humiliated in the club stimulates you to prepare your speech. You see, you can sort of feel it the night before. You can think, boy, I'm going to get this speech going, otherwise I'll flop. That's fine. No problem at all. Stage fright before you speak, before you do anything in front of the public, is probably a good thing to some degree. That won't hurt your heart. That's not going to hurt your emotions. There's also a right kind of a fear of God that has reverence and respect at its core. And that's fine. Not terror of God, but fear of God of a right kind. And I would imagine, and I can't give you a specific statistic on this, but I would think that maybe 10 or 15% of our fears and anxieties are right fears, good anxieties, that you need to have the necessary. And if the good fears and anxieties were all that you had to cope with, there'd be no real problem. There'd be no heart attacks, no hypertension. We wouldn't cut short the lifespan. We wouldn't have people dying of heart disease. It's the other 85 to 90% that are unnecessary, that are morbid, that hurt and harm and damage, that I want to preach and teach about today. Where have they come from? Like I said, from birth we have certain, innate, inborn, proper, right, good, necessary fears. And it's in us to have that predisposition to fear up to a certain point. That's okay. But, of course, that creates a certain fertile environment or a fertile environment in which other fears can grow easily as well. And the fear reaction so many of us have to life is built into us as we grow up and come in contact with Satan's system and with Satan's spirit, which begins to happen the day that you're born. And the spirit of Satan is there in the air. It's every place. His spirit is a spirit of fear, brethren. Satan is so unbelievably afraid of everything and anything. He's afraid of the future. He's afraid of himself. He's afraid of the demons over whom he has charge. He's afraid of their reaction. He's afraid of you and I and of God. Satan is a spirit of fear. And he wallows in it continually. And you see, the fear syndrome that Satan himself is governed by is broadcast by Satan into the air, into society, into everything which is done. And so it permeates society. Now, the socialization process of a child, as a child grows, he is exposed, he becomes vulnerable to that spirit to some degree, and his nature begins to change. And so his life is filled with fear-producing situations which have been rigged by Satan, so the child begins to fear. So his mind becomes, with time, a spirit of fear. Now, some of that would happen automatically even if Satan wasn't there to some degree. Even the fact that a child is very small and he's surrounded by, gigantic adults. It's sort of a scary thing. Remember when you were very small and here were all these gigantic people walking around? It was sort of frightening to some degree. And then a child has a feeling of helplessness and dependency upon his parents. And that preconditions a child when he's very, very young to feel uncertain and edgy about himself. That's also a rather natural thing. But this can be intensified and augmented, and is augmented by Satan the devil, and can be built into a huge, gigantic, very destructive fear syndrome towards everything in life. If a child feels threatened, you see, by illness in the family, and that's very frightening to a child. His mother is very sick, his father is very sick, got a very ill brother or sister, that increases his reaction to fear. He will have more fears than he would otherwise as a child and later on as an adult. If there's a death in a family when the child is very young, that's a very scary thing for a child to cope with. He really can't. And that'll build a certain panic reaction. It'll increase the fear syndrome. If a child has been placed under tension in the home because of a divorce, he'll become alarmed, he'll feel very uncertain. It builds a kind of an inadequacy within the child towards life and a fear of failure and a fear of relationships as well, because certain relationships have been severed and he can't quite cope with that. If you've moved frequently and you've uprooted a child, that will increase his anxiety level as a child. And then the anxiety level, as it increases, will begin to affect his life as a teen and later on as an adult. You see, you increase the level of anxiety in his life. If there have been, if there's been anything along the line of sexual molesting as a child, that's catastrophic, and this intensifies and builds this sort of fear scar tissue within him. Physical abuse does the same thing. It's very scary for a child. Overcritical parents will do it as well, because it's frightening when you have a parent that looks to be perfect and he's saying do this and this and this, and you're dumb and stupid. That, to a child, is an anxiety-filled situation. It's awful to be raised by perfect parents. Oh boy, the kind of parent that has done it all and knows it all and says it all and expects his kid to be perfect and you know you're not. Well, you make him feel very insecure and very frightened. And you also have the overprotective, smothering, overpossessive parent, that transfers his or her fears to the child. And you increase the fear level in the child. The kind of mother that has a fit every time the son plays football and she forbids him to do it. He can't do this and he can't do that. Don't go here and don't go there. And finally, the kid realizes that super mom is not so super after all. She's really a scared mom. Most super moms are scared mothers, terribly scared human beings. But super mom will transfer her fears of society, athletics, and anything to her son, and he will grow up then with, this sort of scared reaction to life, the scar tissue built, into his mind. Now, I want to express any of those, all in any of those events and problems can build a predisposition to fear in a child. You've read the scripture in Proverbs that says if you raise a child up in the way that he should go, it is in the pattern in which he should go. When he's old, when he's an adult, he won't depart from it. The converse, the opposite, is also true. If you raise up a child in the way that he should not go, in the pattern in which he should not live, when he is old, he will not depart from that pattern either. I've seen that substantiated so many times. Virtually every time I talk to an adult who is afraid to pay tithes, who is afraid of a mate to the point where they just can't somehow, deal with the church of God. And I deal with human beings who are dominated by fears and anxieties, fear of themselves, fear of failure, fear of marriage, fear of responsibility, fear of God in a wrong way. It doesn't take much time to go on back to childhood, you see, and find the source of that preconditioning, the events. You can sort of say, well, here, this happened, that happened, it's all there. Raise up a child in a way that he should not go. Teach him to be afraid when he's a kid. He'll be afraid when he's an adult. The lesson I want to emphasize today is that we, as parents, need to be very careful in these end times, that we do not recreate in our kids, as they grow up, patterns that were built into us and that have made it hard for us as adults to have faith in God and to cope with problems. Hard for us to pay tithes and to simply say, God will take charge. I can't pay the rent. I can't make the mortgage, but I'm going to give God his due, and I know he'll take charge. It's hard for some people to do that. Certain patterns in our past lives have made it hard for a lot of us to look to God in simple faith, in deep living faith in the middle of our trials and to say, God is going to take care of me. Now, we need to correct our kids, but you've got to convey love as you do it, so they respect you rather than fear you. I do not want my kids to fear me. Some of you want your kids to fear you, and they do. And someday you'll regret it, and someday they'll regret it. I do want respect. I do want honor. I do want love. I do not want fear. Because fear is so damaging. Now, it's fine to point out flaws in the character of a child on occasion, but also point out the strengths. Point out his mistakes, but point out to him what he does well. You just point out the flaws, brethren. They'll grow up to be afraid of themselves. And that is one of the most hideous, morbid, destructive, devastatingly fatal kind of fears that you can acquire. They'll grow up thinking they're dumb and stupid and incapable, afraid of life, afraid of responsibility. You know the kind of a guy who goes out and gets a job when he's 18 and isn't worth very much, and he stays in that job for 45 to 50 years and never goes anyplace and never does anything. But he's got this little quiet job, and he hangs in there. He won't do anything. He's afraid. He's afraid. Why is he afraid? He's afraid of himself. He doesn't think he can make it. Why doesn't he think he can make it? Because he's afraid of his own weaknesses. Because they've been emphasized year after year after year, and he lives with his fears. He's locked into a kind of a fear syndrome. I remember a terrible thing that occurred in 1956 in Pasadena. There was a young man at the college then, very converted, at least he seemed to be, giving, loving, capable, admired by all. We didn't know that he felt overwhelmed by a sense of his own inadequacy. We didn't know that because he didn't seem to be inadequate. He had many qualities. His fear of failure was a powerful emotion in his life, but nobody knew. You see, he looked so capable, he looked so stable, he looked so able, and he was. But fear ruled his life, and they were obsessed with morbid fears. He couldn't see what great potential he had. He really couldn't. And, we didn't know that. Well, during the summer of 1956, he was sent on a baptizing tour in areas in the USA where there were no churches at the time. And he was sent because he was a student body leader, because he had so many qualities, and everybody knew he could do it. The whole college knew he could do it. The ministry knew he could do it. The problem was, he didn't know he could do it. For a week, he did an excellent job. He talked to people. He showed love and concern. And then on the 8th day of the baptizing tour, he rented a little rowboat and rowed to the center of the lake, and they found the rowboat. A couple of days later, they never found him. Now you see, the fear of self, the fear of your own inadequacy, is one of the most devastating forms of fear that exists, because when you fear the human being that you are, what can you accomplish in life that is worth anything at all? Well, you can when you come into the Church of God. That changes it all. You know, the degree to which we're exposed to fear-producing situation as children, to that degree, fear will reactivate in some of the situations when we become adults. And a little kid is like clay, you see, like plasticine, and you can make a mark, you can make an impression, because it's very flexible at that time in his life. You can make an impact, you can make an impression, and you push it into the clay, and it'll stay. Unless it's pushed out, it'll stay all of his life. He becomes an adult, it's still there. You raise up a child in the way that he shouldn't go. When he is old, he will not depart from it, unless God in His mercy calls him. And then everything changes. Well, Satan uses a lot of circumstances to build within us a mind full of fear, permeated in fact with anxiety, because he knows one of the easiest ways to destroy us and to render us in our own minds incapable and unable to live and to walk in faith, you see. It's to build that kind of fear within us. If he can put you through the emotional ringer and keep you going through it the rest of your life. And isn't that the life history of some of our members? The emotional ringer, day after day, year after year, and you never get out. When you're going through the ringer, going down the tubes, when you're taught as a guitar string, how can you grow very much? He knows you won't. So he does it, you see. He keeps these inner tensions there. Now, faith and fear are clearly total opposites. And Satan wants you to have fear, because he knows when you do, you won't have faith. When you don't have faith, you can't walk with God very well at all. God wants you, of course, to have faith, to have His Spirit. Romans chapter 8, verse 15, speaking to the members of the Church of God, if you turn to that, if you would please. Romans 8, verse 14. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God, and at baptism you're given God's Spirit. Verse 15, for you have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear. Again means a second time. Now all of us have received the spirit of bondage to fear once. Now that's been built into us through Satan's system and by Satan's spirit and his mind broadcasting in society. And he set up the norms and the criteria in society. He has rigged things so that all of these morbid, unnecessary, fear-producing thoughts come flooding into our minds as we grow up and, go out into society. And that's why so many people, if not most people, are emotionally disturbed to some degree. They really are. Very few people walk into the Church of God for the first time, all gung-ho and say, wow, I'm going to... Psychiatrists and psychologists don't understand. All of these professionals out there, and you're Southern California, you know all about therapy, and half of your friends are probably in therapy. That's just the way it is in this part of the country. And there's some good things in some of the therapy, but you go to a certain point, and then you see there are diminishing returns, and they can never go on through and make a real breakthrough and get on top of the problem. Because the real problem is the spirit of fear built into every single living human being, because Satan has done it. And only the Spirit of God can break the back, break the power of that spirit of fear. And give you the assurance and the faith to come out of it. Well, the therapy does a little bit of good, but it can never go all the way. Now, God hasn't given us the spirit of fear. Satan has. That's the core of the problem. God has given us a spirit of power and of love, which is the main fruit of the Spirit of God, and of a sound mind. Now, 1 John 4, verse 18. We're told that once we have the Spirit of God within us and we use His Spirit, we really use it properly, that Spirit will slowly begin, you see, to change the human mind, full of anxieties and tension and fear, and the scar tissue can begin to go. And ultimately the mind can be transformed. Slowly. It doesn't happen overnight. And there'll be some failures and some relapses back into anxiety. Sure, that happens to everybody. But the general direction is up, and slowly but surely that spirit full of fear is going to be changed into a mind full of faith and love and confidence, and it does begin to grow. 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. Very, very clear scripture, brethren. Very, very clear. There is no fear when you are full of the love of God. Now, he means terror here, you see. This means morbid, unnecessary fear. He doesn't mean the good fears. It's good to fear God, that is to have reverence for God and awe for God. It is not good to have terror of God or for God. The balanced fears are fine. Being afraid of having an accident makes you careful when you're in your car. He doesn't mean this. He means the kind of fear that has its origin, brethren, in Satan's system, and that condemns you to a life of immeasurable misery in certain cases, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. There's no fear. You have the love of God, which is a type, in this context, of the Spirit of God, you see. Love is the first fruit that is given to you by the Spirit of God. When you have God's love within you, when you are full of God's Spirit, that fear isn't going to be there. Why? Because perfect love, as you grow in God's Spirit to the point that you ultimately have a full measure of it, you have perfect love, not a little love, not the kind of love you had the first day of your baptism, but you've acquired more, you've grown in it, the love of God is flowing through you, the Spirit of God is there. That perfect love, that full measure of God's Spirit, casts out the fear. Casts it out. And in the Greek it says rips it out or tears it out or removes it by pressure. It's a very powerful verb. Perfect love. That's the Spirit of God. Casts out fear because fear has tormented, has abnormal anxiety. It paralyzes our ability to look to God. And we ought not have those fears. He that fears is not yet made perfect in love. That is, he doesn't have as much of God's Spirit as he should have. But he will have enough of God's Spirit as time goes on. There's something to get on top of this. Every one of us can be free from fear. And the more we have of God's Spirit flowing through us, the less fear is going to be there to block us. And as we try to serve God and do what we should be doing. I want to again emphasize that there are no instant miracles, brethren. Your entire mind that is full of all of these fear reactions. Fear when you look to God. Fear to really step out and paying tithes and being responsible that way. Fear of human beings. All of those things in our mind have got to be removed. And then the mind rebuilt, renewed, healed, and transformed. And if you do the necessary things with time, it's going to happen. I want to go back in the sermon today and simply pick out in closing very, very briefly several points that I think are necessary to understand and to simply reiterate them and prioritize them to some degree. And they're points that can enable any member of the Church of God to rise above anxiety-producing situations. We can't always escape our trials, and God doesn't want us to. But we can learn to deal with trials with faith and love, with the fear basically gone. I want to give you just 7 brief points, and they'll be very brief, so don't worry about the time factor. Number 1, remember, fear is a universal problem. I've already said that. I reiterate the fact. We all share it to some degree because we have all been exposed to Satan's system and to his broadcasting in society. So you see, I have fears. You have fears. We all have anxieties, and no minister is an inaccessible spiritual giant who's never had to struggle with inadequacy and self-doubt and fear, because we all have. You know, the young man who jumped off of a boat in 1956 was no worse than me. He was no worse than me. Maybe he was better than me. But you see, the problem is he thought he was worse than me. He kept saying, I'm the only member of the Church of God who always fails. I'm the only one who won't make it. I'm the only one that's ever gone on a baptizing tour that shouldn't have gone. They've made a mistake with me. His fear made him say that. Sad to realize that those fears were put in his mind by Satan's system. It wasn't realistic to think the way he thought. I think it helps to realize that most fears, if not 90% of them, are the result of preconditioning by society. Sort of pricks the balloon. You sort of say, oh, well, you mean the apprehension I have is sort of been put in my head by Satan's society and by his broadcasting? And the answer is, yeah, most of the time that's the case. Now that doesn't take the fear out. It does make it a little easier to cope with. It sort of pricks the balloon. Notice Genesis chapter 3 quickly. It describes the first emotional crisis in the history of mankind, and the core of it once again was fear. Notice the agent involved in precipitating the crises. Genesis chapter 3 verse 1. The serpent, that's Satan the devil, was more subtle than any beast of the field. So he came around Adam and Eve, and you know the story. And they ate of the fruit of the tree. And Satan was the one involved, and Satan began to broadcast. You want to see how they reacted? First they sinned, and then they became afraid. Chapter 3, verse 7. The eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And, they began to have a sense of having sinned, and it was very, very unsettling and upsetting to them. And they heard the voice of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid themselves from God. In verse 9, the Lord God called unto Adam and said, "Where are you, Adam?" And Adam said, "I heard your voice in the garden." And the first emotional crisis in the history of mankind, I was scared. I was afraid, and I hid myself because I was naked, and because I didn't know what to do, and because I had this ominous feeling of doom. And he was scared of God and of himself and of sin and of Satan and of everything. You see, Satan had begun to build within Adam, like he has in us, this sort of spirit of fear, the fear syndrome in his mind. I was afraid. You ever said that? I think you have. It's a universal problem. I've said that. Well, I could tell you that the first sermon I ever gave, I was so scared. I'll tell you what happened. I was in England at the time, the college in Catherwood, and I was a senior in college. And I'd given a lot of sermonettes, but no sermons. And one day, late Friday afternoon, it was about 4:30, they called me up, and the minister who was in charge of the church in Bristol was ill. He couldn't take the services, and they said, "We want you to go over and give the sermon. Take the whole service." I was petrified, of course. Now, Bristol was a good 4 hours drive from London at the time, and you had to drive over Friday evening because it was too long a drive to drive over on Saturday morning for the afternoon service. So I drove on over to Bristol. I jumped in a car, and with my hands shaking, and drove the 4 hours, madly thinking, what am I going to talk about? I hadn't had a week to plan this, you see. I didn't have any time to plan it. I was told to go and give the sermon. And I arrived at about 7:30 or 8 o'clock on Friday evening in Bristol, still sort of shaken and very apprehensive and very scared and wondering, what in the world am I going to do tomorrow? What do I say? Because I hadn't prepared a thing. And I couldn't think in the car, and my mind was in confusion. And anyway, I thought I better go eat. So I went down, we always stayed in a hotel in Bristol where the services were held, the same hotel. It was called the Grand, if I remember. And the services were on the second floor, and I got a hotel room and spent the night, Friday night, in the hotel room. 8 o'clock I went down to the dining room and to have a meal, see if I could get my nerves in shape and maybe think, and if I ate something I'd feel better. And the waiter came by as I made the order and said, "Would you like a bottle of wine?" Now, I had never drunk wine in my entire life. I still am not a big wine fan, even though I've lived in France, but wine is okay, Well, I was 20 years old, and I should never have been caught dead giving a sermon at that age, but at any rate. There I was, and I said, well, yes. I thought, maybe a little wine, a little glass would help my infirmities and relax me enough so I could go back up to the room and prepare. Now, like I said, I'd never drunk wine before. So he brought this gigantic, it wasn't just a bottle, it must have been a half magnum or something, I don't know what. It was huge. And the church was paying, so I didn't know the difference. So he poured a glass of wine. And I'm sitting there shaking, so I drank the whole glass. I drank it, I drank it. Anyway, down it went. And I ate, and he poured another glass, and I drank it, and I ate and worried and wondered, and then I drank another glass. And I have overdrunk once in my life, brethren, only once in my life that I can think of. It was the night before I gave my first sermon. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was so apprehensive and so nervous and so tense. He kept pouring wine in that glass, and I kept drinking the wine. 10 o'clock came, and they were closing the restaurant, of course. At 10 o'clock, they began to close the doors, and the waiter sort of, coughed, and it's obviously wants you to leave. And I tried to get up, and I couldn't get up. No way could I get up out of that chair. As I remember, I had 4 cups of coffee, and I ordered 2 desserts. And finally, I was able to get out of the restaurant, where you make yourself think, okay, 1 foot, you put one in front of the other, and you get out of there, trying very hard not to be obvious. And I got back to the inn for 2 hours. I couldn't think. My head was spinning. I felt absolutely awful. And about 1 o'clock, he wore off enough where I could begin to prepare. From 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning, I prepared the beginning of a sermon and got in bed at about 3:30, and I woke up at about 7 because my nerves woke me up. I was shot and completely exhausted, but my nerves woke me back up at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I got about 3 hours sleep. I had a terrible headache. You know what that means. And at about 1 o'clock, the headache blew over finally.
And I went down for services in Bristol at 1:30. And I doubt that those poor people in Bristol had any idea that the fellow who got up to give them the sermon was just recovering from a rather minor hangover, but it was nonetheless a hangover. It was awful. And I look back on that and think, why in the world did that happen? I mean, what did God think of it? What was God's reaction to what I did? I think He was merciful. What can you expect of a 20-year-old idiot? I mean, you know. It was just... The funny thing was, after it was over, I had several people say it was a pretty good sermon. I remember that very clearly. One lady who sat in the front row that kept eating mince all during the services said afterward it was not a bad sermon. Well, I'm glad of that. At least God got something accomplished. The point is this. That happened because of anxiety. All of us have gone through that kind of experience. If you realize that it is a universal problem, it can make it a whole lot easier to cope with yourself. Second point I want to mention in summary is this. We are told in the Bible not to fear. Permeate your mind with that concept. You need to realize that fear is not a part of God's plan for us now. It's His perfect will for you to live without it. Some people think, oh, well, God must use fear somehow to help us grow. He doesn't say that. It's not a part of His plan. Permeate your mind with the concept that you ought to be able to live without it, and you can. Point number 3, admit your fears to God. Admit them to God. Tell Him what you're afraid of. Express it to yourself, express it to Him. You see, the only way to overcome a problem that you have is to admit it to yourself first of all, then you've got to get it out in the open. You see it, then you admit it to God. You can't kick any habit, I don't care what it is, be it too much alcohol or too much of this or too much of that, until you confess it to yourself. You really confess it to yourself, and you see the problem, and then you confess it to God, and you let Him look at the problem. That's very therapeutic and very necessary. Now, this is where psychotherapy of any kind breaks down. Because the therapist, the psychiatrist, gets you to admit your problem to yourself, you admit it to him, but he's not God. That's only half the process. That starts healing going, but it never completes. It never comes to fruition. There's no culmination. There is no real emotional or mental healing involved. Only partial. Very partial. You've got to admit it to you and see it. You'll never resolve a problem that you hide from. But then you've got to admit it to God. Let Him see it. And then ask God to give full emotional healing to you by His Spirit as He forgives you, you see, and you forgive yourself. He forgives and you forgive. He forgives you and you forgive you. They've got to be combined. Then His Spirit begins to heal the memories and strengthen your mind. And the miracle just starts to roll, you see. It really starts to roll. God has put something in the human heart where you need confession. Now, some of these professional people have stumbled on that. You see, they lay you down on the couch and say, tell me all about it. Now, they know that helps. You need to confess the problem. People in the world have seen that. You've got to confess it to yourself, and you've got to confess it to God. Then you complete the circle, and the healing begins to come. And number 4, very quickly ask God to fill you with His Spirit, but there are 3 fruits you have to have. Number 4 is the love of God. Perfect love casts out fear. Ask God for more love every day. Don't just get down on your knees every day and say, please God, give me more of your Spirit, and then you rush on to something else. You have a fear problem, an anxiety problem, a problem having enough faith and confidence in God. Ask God for love every single day in combination. Point 5 with faith. Number 5 is ask God for faith. The fearful people need a whole lot more faith. They need love and they need faith. Ask God to give you more faith and do it every single day. Don't let a day go by where you don't do it. To those that ask for specific fruits. The number 6 is also ask God for the fruit of peace. So you have number 4, that's love. 5 is faith. 6 is the fruit of peace. The 3 combine and work together, you see, in your mind, changing your mind, rebuilding your mind. Some of you don't need the fruit of gentleness. That's the fruit of the Spirit. But some of you are very gentle people by nature. Some of you are very good people by nature. And perhaps you don't need God's goodness placed within you. Very few of you by nature have a lot of love, a lot of faith, a lot of peace. The spirit of fear that Satan has built into your mind has destroyed the human love to some degree. The human faith that some people have and the peace that's got to be put back in. And those are the only antidotes. Love, faith, the fruit of peace. John chapter 14, notice what Christ said just before He died. It was a horrendous time for the disciples and for Jesus Christ. Very, very frightening. John 14 verse 27, He said, peace I leave with you.
My peace I give unto you. Not as the world gives, but something greater, more powerful, more potent, more dramatic, that changes people's lives. You don't have to be ripped to emotional stress every single day because somebody rejects us, or somebody's unkind, or a child is not obedient. I'll leave peace with you, not what the world can give. I'll give you something else far more powerful. Therefore, let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. That's a command, and there is a way. You've got to ask God to permeate your mind daily with His love, with His faith, with His peace. Then you can have that peace that the world cannot give. And your heart doesn't have to be troubled. The last and the seventh point, once again, is always remember that from the time of baptism on, you have never, ever been alone. Now maybe you've been deserted by people around you, but you're never alone from that point on. You have direct access to Jesus Christ, and He is always there. See, at baptism, something happens. The Father gives you to Jesus Christ. Did you know that? When the minister said, in the swimming pool or in the lake, in the watery grave, do you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? And you said, yes, I do. At that specific moment, the Father said to Jesus Christ, now He has accepted you, and I commit Him to you, and you become His guide, His leader, His Savior. Before baptism, the Father basically works with you, you see. The Father picks you out. You can't come to Jesus Christ like the Spirit of the Father draws you. The Father works with you and says, I want him or her in the church of God. He leads you through repentance. And at baptism, the Father gives you to Jesus Christ, and Christ becomes actively involved, and you have never, ever again, from that point on, been alone. That changes an awful lot in our lives. You may think you've been alone, but you haven't. That's in your head. As expression goes, so many things are in our head. The fear reactions, that's just in our head. The Spirit is here. Sometimes we fear that God is not there. He's always there. That's our imagination. We've got to view it as such. Hebrews chapter 13. In closing, a couple of quick scriptures. The principle is so unbelievably important to understand that it's very simple, very basic. Hebrews 13, verse 5. Let your conversation or conduct be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, with your style of life and the circumstances in your life. For He has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. And He can't, because the Father has said to Jesus Christ, from the moment of baptism, stay with Him. You've got to be with Him. Stay with Him. And brethren, Jesus Christ will not disobey His Father. He has stayed with you. He has said, I will never leave. I will not forsake you. So that we can boldly say with courage and faith and assurance, the Lord is my helper. That makes shivers go up and down my spine, because it doesn't say the Lord is my boss, my leader, my king. This is so full of humility, it's almost impossible to understand. It says the Lord is my helper. Therefore I will not fear what man shall do to me. No fear. Psalms chapter 118 verse 6. The same principle, the same kind of promise. Psalms 118 verse 6. The Lord is on my side. He has to be, brethren. The Father has told him to be on your side. He can't and will not leave. The Lord is on my side. We are never alone. Therefore, I will not fear. I will not fear, because He is there, and we can overcome the spirit of fear. I won't fear what man can do to me, what society can do. Last scripture, Psalm 23. You've read it many, many times before. Notice the peace that David had when he wrote this, and the assurance. The spirit of fear was slowly being overcome. It doesn't happen overnight, but with time it will occur. We can get on top of these fear reactions. Psalms 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I won't want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures, and He leads me beside the still waters. There's so much peace in what David is saying, and assurance, and solid faith. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for the sake of His name. And even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, even when there are horrendous problems, and the world seems to be collapsing all around me, and anxiety begins to well up, I can push it back down and get back on top. I don't have to fear any evil, because, you see, He is with me. The Father said to Jesus Christ, when you said to the minister, yes, I have accepted Him as my personal Savior, at that point in the third heavens, the Father said to Jesus Christ, He has accepted you. He has accepted you. Now you're to be with them, and you can't leave. And He is not, because He obeys His Father. I will fear no evil. You're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table in the presence of my enemies. And sure, there are problems there sometimes. But Christ will always anoint our head with oil. The Spirit of God will keep on flowing. We won't have to have fear reactions. My cup runs over, and goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And I'll dwell in the house of the eternal forever. Brethren, we can exchange fear for courage. We don't have to have fear reactions in these end times. We need God and the Spirit of God and His promises, and we can get on top of these things. And we will. We will. That's a promise.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.